The subject of this video is Sukkot and the concept of happiness. Sukkot, according to the Jewish tradition, is called the time of our joy, Zman Simchatenu, and the Hebrew word simcha means joy and also more broadly happiness. So that Sukkot, according to the Jewish tradition, is to be a time of joy and happiness. What I want to do in this video is I want to examine three practices that are a part of our observance of Sukkot. And regarding each of these three practices, there's something very strange in relation to the concept of happiness. So the first practice is the sitting in the sukkah, which is a temporary hut. So on the first 7 days of the 8 days of Sukkot, we are to sit in a sukkah, temporary hut, to leave the comfort of our permanent home and to live in a sukkah. And this is, according to the Jewish tradition, biblical law based on the Bible. And it's in commemoration of the wanderings of our ancestors the Israelites, who, in commemoration of their wanderings in the wilderness, after escaping from slavery in Egypt, the first mass slave escape in recorded history, and the Israelites then formed themselves into a people Israel in the wilderness, and in their wanderings they lived in Sukkot, according to the biblical account, Sukkot temporary huts. And so that on Sukkot, we are to dwell in the sukkah. The commandment is to sit in the sukkah, but it's to sit in the sense of dwell. We're to dwell in the sukkah in commemoration of our ancestors dwelling in Sukkot in their wanderings in the wilderness. And to sit in the sukkah, then, the commandment means to eat and sleep in the sukkah. Now, that's by law. By way of custom, today, oftentimes Jews do not sleep in the sukkah, we only eat in the sukkah, but that's by way of custom. By way of law, we're actually to eat and sleep in the sukkah, and this is in fulfillment of the biblical law, according to the Jewish tradition, that we're to dwell in sukkah, on Sukkot, in commemoration of our ancestors living in Sukkot in the wilderness. And what's strange here, regarding this practice in relation to the concept of happiness, is that if Sukkot is the time of our joy and happiness, then wouldn't we be happier in the comfort of our permanent home? Why leave the comfort of our permanent home to live in the sukkah during the first 7 days out of the 8 days of Sukkot? The second practice, then, is the taking of the lulav, the waving of a lulav. And lulav is a palm branch, and this also is biblical law according to the Jewish tradition based upon the Bible. And according to Jewish tradition, the lulav is a palm branch, and it's surrounded by myrtle and willow branches. And we take that in one hand, the lulav, so that the term lulav includes the palm branch itself, the lulav, and the myrtle and willow branches. And we take those branches in one hand, the lulav, and we take an etrog, according to a citrus fruit, which according to Jewish tradition is an etrog, and we take the etrog in the other hand and we wave them as a part of the morning prayer service, again on the first 7 days of Sukkot, not on the 8th day, but on the first 7 days of the 8 days of Sukkot. We wave the lulav as a part of the morning prayer service. And when we take the lulav and waving it, we make a blessing over it. And the blessing is over the lulav and not over the etrog. And this is very strange because, again, if Sukkot is a time of joy and happiness, then aren't we happier with the etrog? The etrog is a fruit that has value, usefulness. You can eat the etrog, you can make jelly out of it. The lulav is really just dead branches that have no value and no usefulness. So why make the blessing then over the lulav? Okay, that's number 2. Number 3, the practice that's by way of custom, not a matter of law, but by way of custom, on Sukkot, we're to read the book of Kohelet in Hebrew. In English, Ecclesiastes. The book of Kohelet, there's a custom that we're to read Kohelet on Sukkot. And Kohelet, it's often, it's widely understood as a philosophic work. And in my mind, that's a misconception. It's a misconception because if it's a philosophic work, it's an philosophic work, much like modern existential literature and philosophy. In fact, Kohelet really precedes modern existentialism by some couple of thousand years. And the modern existentialist movement of the 19th, 20th centuries is an philosophic movement. And the great existentialist philosophers actually didn't write systematic philosophy in the main. What they usually wrote were works of an artistic nature, stories, novels, and the movement's an anti-philosophic movement, anti-metaphysical in orientation, and a major theme of modern existentialism is that life has no inherent meaning, and there's a kind of tone of despair that characterizes existentialist literature. So if we go back to the book of Kohelet, they say it really precedes modern existentialist literature by several thousand years, and first of all, the style is an artistic style. It's not written in the form of systematic philosophy, like modern existentialism. It's a book that's filled with contradictions in a systematic way. And contradictions, the philosophy is to clarify issues, and contradictions confuse issues rather than clarifying. So the style really precedes modern existentialism, being an artistic style filled with internal contradictions. And then in terms of content, there's the book of Kohelet. The major theme of the book is that everything is meaningless, no inherent meaning in life. That the book begins by declaring that all is vain, everything is vain, meaningless. And there's a tone of despair, much like, again, modern existentialist literature that colors the book of Kohelet, of despair and that life has no meaning, all is vain. So the obvious question is regarding Kohelet, if Sukkot, again, is a time of joy and happiness, why should we read such a book that's going to perhaps lead us to a feeling of despair and despondency rather than joy and happiness? So these are the questions I want to address now. So I'll start with the sitting in the sukkah. And I want to begin by telling a story, a true story of a Hindu teacher. Hinduism, of course, a mystical tradition that emerged in ancient India, and the great Hindu teachers were teachers who had achieved some kind of enlightenment, wisdom of how to live, and oftentimes lived in poverty. So this is a true story of a Hindu teacher of the 20th century who had a fairly large following in the United States. And he would oftentimes give lectures or seminars in the United States, but he himself lived in poverty. And so the story is that one time he was giving a lecture, a seminar in the United States, and there was an American who raised his hand to ask a question. And when the American raised his hand, you could see his hand was trembling, that he was afraid. And you could hear also when he began to speak in his voice that he was afraid. And the American said, "Look," he said to the Hindu teacher, "I have everything it takes in terms of material comfort and wealth to be happy. I have everything it takes in terms of material comfort, wealth, financially he's very well off." He said, "I'm also very well respected." He had a well-respected profession. He's well respected in the eyes of others. Profession might have been like a lawyer, if I'm not mistaken. But in any case, he said he's very well respected. He has everything in terms of material wealth and comfort, that he is everything that he would need to be happy. And yet, he said, the American, that he's despairing and despondent and depressed. Of course, what he was afraid of is that the Hindu teacher was going to tell him that he would have to give up all of his material wealth and comfort in order to be happy. And so what the Hindu teacher said to him is, what you'll have to give up to be happy is even more difficult than what you're afraid you'll have to give up. Or what he's afraid he'll have to give up is the material comfort. And he said it's even more difficult than that, what you'll have to give up. And he said what you'll have to give up to be happy is your wrong thinking. And what is his wrong thinking, the American? He thinks that happiness is something external, that it's dependent on material comfort and wealth and being well respected in the eyes of others. It's something external. And in Hebrew, the word for happiness, the word simcha, it said that sukkot is zman simchatenu, the time of our joy, really means joy. It can mean more broadly happiness, but it's happiness more connected to joy. And there's another word, happiness, in Hebrew that really has more of a sense of fulfillment. And that is the word osher. And it's written with an aleph, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And the same word osher can be written with an ayin, which is, if I'm not mistaken, the 16th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, osher. And osher with an ayin means wealth, riches. Osher with an aleph, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, means happiness in the sense of fulfillment. And notice that the ayin, the 16th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, osher in the sense of wealth, is far from the aleph, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, osher, happiness. That you can see it in the language then of Hebrew, that material wealth doesn't bring happiness. Happiness in the sense of, in Hebrew again, with an aleph, osher. In Hebrew, the letters have a numerical value, so that the aleph as the first letter of the Hebrew language has a numerical value of 1, and 1 symbolizes God. And God then is spiritual, so that osher, happiness in the sense of fulfillment, is spiritual, internal. It's not something external, material wealth and riches. It's something internal of a spiritual nature. And by the way, there's a teaching in the Talmud that is the same message as this Hindu teacher was giving to the American. And the teaching in the Talmud says that who is the truly wealthy person, rich person? It's the one who is happy with his or her lot. And here the term happy is simcha, in the sense of joy, happiness. Who's the truly wealthy person? The one who is happy with his or her lot. And also the Buddha. Buddhism also a mystical tradition that emerged in ancient India, and Buddha means enlightened one. The Buddha wasn't a god according to Buddhism, and the Buddha wasn't, or at least the Buddha didn't consider himself to be a god. He is a teacher who had achieved enlightenment, was called the enlightened one, Buddha. And one of the teachings of the Buddha is that the Buddha said, if you have no expectations, then you have everything. And this is the same point as the Talmudic teaching. Who's the truly rich person? The one who is happy with his or her lot. If you're happy with your lot, you don't have expectation of more. And notice that external things like that of especially of a material nature, material comfort, material wealth, you're never satisfied. There's a hunger for material, external things, that hunger is insatiable. It's never satisfied. No matter how much you have, you always want more. It's like there's always a feeling that you want more, you need more, a feeling. Even though you don't need more, you have a feeling that you need more, you want more. So that it's never satisfying. It can never bring happiness. And the true happiness, then, again, is something spiritual. It's internal. And I'll come back to this point shortly. But it's something internal. And so to go back to the Hindu teacher, the Hindu teacher was saying, what this American will have to change is his wrong thinking. And that's not so simple, because it is simple and easy to understand between the ears intellectually that external material things do not bring happiness. It's easy to understand here, but on the experiential level, To change that belief deep down in the heart, that's very difficult. This American has an attachment, a dependency on his material wealth. And you could see it on the experiential level, that his hand was trembling, his voice was trembling, and you could hear the fear. So that for him to change that on the experiential level will be very, very difficult. And notice that this is something that's ingrained in our culture in the Western world, that happiness is if we're dependent on something external. It's there in the Western culture, also especially in the American culture, that we speak of pursuing happiness. In the American culture, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. As if happiness is, we pursue it, we need to find it, it's something external to us. It's as if it's hiding under some unturned stone, and we have to uncover enough stones to find it. Okay, but true happiness, and again I'll come back to this point, is really internal. It's something of a spiritual nature and internal. And now in terms of Sukkot then, of leaving the home, the comfort of our permanent home, to live in the sukkah. So what I want to suggest is that this does not represent an ideal of asceticism, of denial of physical material pleasures. There is such an ideal in Christianity. Christianity is characterized by a dualism, a dichotomy of spirit and matter, physical and spirit and matter, spiritual and physical, heavenly and earthly. And everything that's spiritual and heavenly is seen as good and eternal. And everything that's physical and material is seen as sinful and evil. So that the ideal then is asceticism, of denial of physical material pleasures, to live the life of a monk, a life of celibacy, chastity, and poverty. And notice then that poverty in Christianity is seen as an ideal. This is the ideal of the monk: celibacy, chastity, and poverty. So in Judaism, there is no ideal of poverty, and the material world is not seen as sinful. Judaism is characterized not by a dichotomy, a dualism. Judaism is characterized by unity. Again, God is one, the universe is one, so that when God looks over all of creation, in the opening account of creation in the Bible, in the biblical account of creation, God looks over all of creation. God says, Hine tov me'od, behold, it is very good, God proclaims of the universe. Behold, it is very good. And that means that the material world is good. Nothing can be sinful or evil in Judaism in and of itself in an inherent way coming from God, from a good God. Everything is good. Our bodies are good and not sinful. And the material world is good and not sinful. So that there's no ideal in Judaism of asceticism, of denial of physical material pleasures. But what I want to suggest is that we're leaving the comfort of our home on Sukkot for 7 days of the 8 days of Sukkot. We're leaving the comfort of our permanent home to live in the Sukkah, to kind of break this attachment that we have, that we have this feeling deep down that we're dependent on material comfort for our happiness. And one way to break that is to give up all of our material comfort and wealth. But notice that the Hindu teacher, again to go back to the story, the Hindu teacher wasn't telling the American that he has to give up his material wealth and comfort. What he has to do is to break the attachment. And one way to do that is to give it up entirely. But that's not the only way. So Sukkot is a way that I think that it's a means. It's not an ideal of asceticism or denial. But we're denying our material comfort. We're leaving the comfort of the home as a means to break that attachment, that we're not dependent on that for our happiness. When our ancestors lived in temporary huts in the wilderness, they were in a sense closer to God, closer to nature, living in nature, dependent on God, meaning less dependent on external things for a feeling of happiness and joy. That's the reason we're leaving, I think, the comfort of our home to live in a sukkah. So that's point number one. Point number two, the taking of the lulav. And here I want to come to the point that happiness is something internal and spiritual. So in the taking of the lulav, we're making the blessing over the lulav and not over the fruit. Why? Okay, so here I want to explain a fundamental idea of modern humanistic and cognitive psychology. That what does cognitive mean? It means thinking. That we as human beings are thinking creatures. and different in the sense than any other animal. Okay, in the Bible, the term is that the human being is created in the image of God. We're different fundamentally than any other animal. And what distinguishes us from other animals is this cognitive quality that we're thinking creatures. We interpret reality, and this is very different than all other animals. So, to give an example, a dog. Let's take a dog. Now, a dog has drives and passions. Okay, we have drives and passions. That's a part of our animal nature. Okay, so animals have drives and passions, feelings. So let's take a dog, and I have a dog biscuit, okay, and this dog is hungry. Assuming the dog is hungry and I have a dog biscuit. Upon seeing the dog biscuit and smelling it, the dog is already happy and joyful. The dog will jump up and down and bark, and its tail will wag, and especially it'll be joyful if it receives the dog biscuit. It eats the dog biscuit, and then what happens? The feeling is temporary, it's fleeting. So upon eating the dog biscuit, the feeling then will quickly disappear, okay? But what happens if the dog is faced with unwanted reality? Okay, unwanted reality. Receiving the dog biscuit is desired reality. Okay, the dog wants the dog biscuit, assuming it's hungry. So, what happens unwanted reality? I have the dog sees the dog biscuit, and I give it to another dog. So the dog who didn't receive the dog biscuit will feel sadness, disappointment. But again, that feeling is temporary, it's fleeting. The dog, it'll pass shortly. So notice that the dog doesn't interpret reality. So the dog can't cause itself depression or to despair, to be despondent. The dog can't say things to itself that this is a part of our cognitive nature as human beings. The dog doesn't have this cognitive aspect, so the dog can't say things like, why me? Why does that happen to me? Why do things like this happen to me, that the dog didn't receive the dog biscuit? Why me? Why? I'm no good. Nobody likes me. Okay, the dog can't make statements like that and cause itself depression. That's something that's uniquely human. So this is what's being symbolized by the lulav, is that oftentimes in life we get dead branches. We don't get the fruit that we would want. We're faced with unwanted reality. If we get the fruit, we'll have no problem being happy and joyful, just like the dog. Maybe we won't jump up and down, we don't bark, but we'll sing and dance, okay? We'll be happy and joyful just like the dog, no problem. But what happens when we're faced with dead branches, okay? So here, we can't always change reality. We don't always have the power to change. This is what happens in life, is oftentimes we get dead branches in life. But we always have the power to change. And this is a fundamental principle then of, again, humanistic cognitive psychology. We always have the power to change our attitude, our outlook. So, and this is the famous analogy that modern humanistic and cognitive psychologists give of the cup filled half with water. Is it half full or half empty? Well, we don't always have the power to change reality, but we always have the power to change how we look at reality. Will we see the cup as half full or half empty? Dead branches, is it a problem or an opportunity? Notice that we think, just like with happiness, that we think it's out there somewhere under some uncovered stone, that we have to pursue it and to find it. We also think there's problems out there that are kind of obstacles to our finding happiness. Problems aren't out there either. Problems are a function of perspective. It's seeing the cup of life as half empty, a problem. The very same situation can be viewed as an opportunity. Even if the dead branches have no usefulness, we can't find any use for them. Nevertheless, this is an opportunity for us to grow, to learn how to deal with adversity in life, to learn how to build our character, to make ourselves a stronger person in dealing with adversity. So that when we're blessing over the lulav, we're blessing over the lulav to remind ourselves that oftentimes in life, this is what we get, is dead branches in life. We're faced with unwanted reality, and we're not going to fall into a despair or a depression. We're going to accept unwanted reality with a joyful heart. A joyful heart doesn't mean we're going to sing and dance like when we get the etrog, the sweet fruit. We're not going to sing and dance with the dead branches. But we're not going to fall into a depression or a despair, a despondency. We're going to have a joyful heart in seeing the cup as half full, of seeing blessings rather than curses, opportunities rather than problems. We're going to see that this is at least an opportunity to grow and to develop ourselves as a person and learning how to deal with adversity. So that's the second point in regard to Sukkot. The third thing is now the book of Kohelet. So Kohelet, in saying that everything is meaningless, all is vain, okay, a central theme of the book. Notice that when you say that everything is meaningless, like the book of Kohelet, that means then that there is no God, at least in the biblical conception of God. So the biblical conception of God is a God who is not just powerful in having created the universe, but is a God of revelation and redemption, a God who's revealed in the world as a God of redemption, a God who demands morality, and a God who is provident, who cares about us, a good God. So that if there is such a God in the biblical conception, a good God who is provident and who is a God of revelation and redemption, then there's inherent meaning in life. So when Kohelet declares that there's no meaning in life, in an indirect way, Kohelet is saying that there's no God in the biblical conception. And therefore this book was a very difficult book in terms of, there was a question whether to include it in the canonization of the Bible by the Talmudic rabbis of the Hebrew Bible, the canonization by the Talmudic rabbis, whether to include it as sacred literature. And eventually they included it. And I think the reason they included it is because, and there's a very pragmatic, what I call orthoprax a very pragmatic orientation, orthoprax orientation of the Jewish tradition. Orthoprax, correct deeds, an emphasis on deeds and not theology, of deeds, that Judaism is a way of life of the Jewish people. And again, there's no term Judaism in the Bible or in the Talmud. The term that the Talmudic rabbis use for Judaism is Torah. And Torah, it can mean the 5 books of Moses specifically, but it means Judaism as a whole. And the literal meaning is guidance, instruction. Judaism is legal guidance, it's moral, and most importantly, moral and spiritual guidance of how to live. And so that even, I think the Talmudic rabbis, in my view, were willing to include Kohelet in the biblical canon as sacred literature, because even if you do assume that there's no God, Judaism gives meaning to our lives. Even if there's no inherent meaning, Judaism gives meaning to our lives. It gives us instruction of how to live from a legal point of view, and especially from a moral and spiritual point of view, so that we're not fearful of Kohelet's questions and the philosophic difficulties that Kohelet raises. And it's especially at Sukkot then, the time of our joy and happiness, that we're going to read Kohelet, when we're less likely then to allow the book to lead us into, to cause us to fall into a despair or a despondency or a depression. That we'll read it during the time of Sukkot, where we're happy and joyful, and we can face Kohelet's questions without fear, knowing that Judaism gives us meaning and significance to our lives. So this is Sukkot then. Thank you.